Hi, everyone. So it's my pleasure to kick off this session, which is full of fantastic early career researchers. And on that point, I would say I am also replacing a PhD student at Duke, Kevin Kamkosanke, who couldn't make it to this conference because of the Trump administration visa policies. So I'm presenting this meta-analysis and systematic review. It was funded by the Center for Global Development, and we have a working paper out, but this presentation will sort of show a revised set of results, updated sort of in the last year. Okay, so we've heard at this conference that social safety nets have been promoted as a tool to increase women's status, reduce inter-household gender inequalities, in the acknowledgement, of course, of the many ways that poverty is gendered. And this was particularly highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw sort of rising care burdens, as well as violence against women and social safety nets responding to this sort of care and gendered crisis. However, despite a lot of calls from international actors, we still know that there's quite a few gaps in terms of implementation of programs and policies and systems that are sort of gendered. And so one question we would like to ask, of course, is do social safety nets in their current form actually empower women? And there's quite a bit of literature that suggests that they can. However, there's been no systematic review and meta-analysis to date of this sort of body of literature. And in addition, we know that there are ways that social safety nets can actually potentially increase gender inequalities, and I think we'll hear a bit about that in the rest of this panel as well. So I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but how could social safety nets actually lead to increases in women's agency and economic status? Well, you have the inputs here, the social safety net, complementary linkages or services. This could lead to increased resources for women in terms of both capital, cash, and knowledge or other types of resources. This could then lead to agency within the household, increased decision-making, et cetera, and then to economic achievements, including labor force participation and economic outcomes. And this, of course, is underlaid by gender norms in a particular setting, as well as sort of in households themselves. Okay, so the research objectives of this paper are to ask 4 questions, and I'm going to focus mainly on the first question in this presentation, and that's what is the direction and magnitude of impact of social safety nets on women's economic achievements and agency. And then I'm going to also touch briefly on a few additional questions, which is how this might vary by different design components of a particular program and the setting, target group, et cetera. What is the cost effectiveness or return on these investment on these sorts of interventions? And then what are key research gaps going forward? Okay, so we did sort of a traditional systematic review process where we searched various databases. We looked at studies that were done experimentally, so randomized controlled trials in low and middle income settings in the last 20 years. We broadly followed the World Bank Aspire classification in terms of social safety nets. And these searches were sort of updated till the end of 2024, so quite recent. And in total, we started with about 4,000 search hits in databases, plus another 1,000 from other sources, and ended up with an analysis sample of 115 papers, representing 93 studies, and about 1,300 effect sizes. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the methodology too much, but this was sort of also standard meta-analysis methodology where we sort of standardize mean effect sizes so that higher is better. We converted these into Cohen's D's and then Hedges G's, which is an effect size which accounts for possible bias due to small sample sizes. And we run a random variance estimation meta-analysis separately for the whole sample and then by type of intervention, so type of social safety net, and outcome measure. And this sort of accounts for the different outcome types and intervention types within one study. So we account for clustering of a particular study when we're pooling the different effects. Just to give a quick snapshot of the papers over time, so we actually see a huge explosion in the number of papers that are looking at these women's outcomes. So we see concentration in the last 10 years, but sort of half of the sample is actually in the last 5 years. So just a few years ago, we wouldn't have been able to do this sort of meta-analysis. And the geographical concentration is, perhaps unsurprisingly to some of you in the audience, is actually heavily concentrated in the Africa region. So almost 60% of the effects are in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by South Asia. Latin America and the Caribbean only has 11% of the impacts at this point. Okay, so just to give a snapshot of sort of the descriptive statistics here, on the left side you can see the intervention types, and this is by the number of effects. So in total, there's 1,300 effects, and most of these, almost 800 of them, are from unconditional cash transfer programs, followed by assets, conditional cash transfers, in-kind transfers, public works, and social care. And you can see the darker blue here on the bars is the number of effects from these types of social safety nets with plus components. So about 75% of the effects are actually from social safety nets with some kind of plus component, and these are typically training, information, health components, or livelihood components. And on the right side, you can see the types of outcomes that we meta-analyze. And in the blue are the economic achievement outcomes, and the pink are the agency outcomes. So you can see most of the impacts are actually on economic outcomes, and these are concentrated on the labor force types of outcomes, so productivity, work intensity, labor force participation, assets and savings. And then the agency outcomes are dominated by decision-making inside the household, autonomy and self-efficacy, voice, aspiration, and we actually looked for a few more types of outcomes, for example, leadership, but didn't really find enough there to analyze. So in terms of the sort of programs, we're looking at an average of a 1-year program with a mean follow-up period of 14 months post-intervention. Okay, so what are our headline effects? These are the pooled effects by the outcome type, and the first row are the pooled for economic and for agency. So we can see the pooled impacts in both cases are significant. And for economic, the pooled impacts are strongest for asset ownership, savings, and expenditure. And they're insignificant for debt and loans, as well as care work intensity. And for agency, we can see that sort of the effects are distributed, but they're all sort of overlapping confidence intervals there. And for a few different outcomes for any care work, for aspirations, goals, leadership, there wasn't sufficient sample size to estimate effects. So when we look by intervention type, again here, the top sort of bar is the pooled effects and then by different social safety net type. And we can see the impacts are most robust for unconditional cash transfers, asset transfers, and public works. For food in-kind transfers, the effects are insignificant, and for conditional cash transfers, they're actually the lowest in magnitude. And actually, this conditional cash transfer type is actually the only sort of interaction that we find in terms of study design, whereby conditional cash transfers are correlated with a lower overall impact as compared to unconditional cash transfers. Okay, so in summary, we find that social safety nets have a positive and significant overall impact on both women's economic achievements and on agency. And in terms of sort of how you should think about the magnitude of this effect, there's a few comparisons in this table here. So in comparison to microcredit pooled effects from 14 studies, this impact is more significant and higher in magnitude. It's about the same as a recent meta-analysis found on vocational training and impacts on women's labor force and market interventions. So we're sort of at par with social safety nets and impacting on women's economic achievements as compared to vocational training evidence out there. So these impacts carry over to individual indicators and across many types of social safety nets. I didn't show sort of the correlate analysis in the meta-regressions, and that's because it's actually not too interesting. As I mentioned before, the only correlate we found associated with a lower Hedges G pooled effect was conditionalities. And while we tried to sort of look at the cost benefit across these papers, only about 25% reported any kind of sort of return on investment, cost benefit analysis. And of those, only 5 included some sort of gender outcome in their calculations. So sort of while these papers, now we have a very large literature on gender and social safety nets, by and large, they're not actually including the benefits to women in their cost benefit analysis. Okay, so we see that the literature on social safety nets and women's outcomes has really increased rapidly over especially the last 5 years, including a lot of focus on the Africa region. But of course, gaps remain, and we see sort of a lower number of studies looking at care services and public works and subsidies as compared to the traditional social assistance, unconditional cash transfers, conditional cash transfers, et cetera. And I think one thing that, of course, we find these very nice, significant pooled effects, but we also see that within the literature that we're looking at and that we're aggregating, most of the papers actually had some sort of gender-sensitive design. We're targeting women in the first place, and that was the rationale for including those impacts sort of in the studies. And so we know much less about what happens in the case of a gender-neutral social safety net, or one that didn't sort of set out to move these indicators in the first place. And so I think we need this testing of the broader designs. We also need more testing of design and operational features. We didn't really find a lot in our meta-regression of what was correlated with these high effects according to design. And so I think, given this evidence, I think there's a strong case for continued advocacy for including sort of gender-sensitive designs and making the case, especially as budgets shrink. Thank you.